Hello, wonderful people. Welcome back. All right, so now we're going to get into chapter 2, which has a lot of good information in it and a little bit more informative in the sense that it moves beyond just definitions. Okay, so let's get started. Chapter 2. Again, talks about strategic leadership. It does a nice overview again about strategic leadership involves vision, designing strategic actions, and of course, to achieve the vision is the reason you have these actions put in place. All right. Okay, so we talked about that. We talked about missions in the last chapter. So, what are we going to be talking about in this one? Well, a reminder as I'm talking with you throughout the semester or for the rest of the semester, I'm looking at you and chatting with you as though you're CEOs, CFOs, chief operating officers, chief IT officers, to make a long story short, and some of you may be already in those situations. I'm looking and chatting with you as though you're already in an executive level. Remember your four major resources, which we'll touch on more than once throughout the semester, right? You have your material resources, your information resources, your HRM, your human resources, and of course your financial resources. And this chapter also talks a little bit about building of strong cultures, organizational cultures, in particular, the chapter puts an emphasis on entrepreneurial culture. Okay. It says here to be effective or to be most effective, you, as strategic leaders, need a management team composed of members who see and think differently. Think about that. I mean, we've seen organizations, many of us, where everyone's a yes person and there's not much diversity in concepts and ideas. And of course, this leads to a lot of status quo thinking. And of course, we've seen the results of how that worked in organizations like the banking and big organization like GM. It's really had a real negative impact. I remember when Chrysler, back in the 1970s, when they had their first taste of being on the edge of going out of business, and they brought in a outsider, for lack of a better term, to be the CEO, who brought in an attitude of lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way, which was his mantra, Lee Iacocca. Brought in someone who kind of shook up the status quo a little bit within the organization to help the organization get back on track. And shortly thereafter, there was the birth of a thing called a minivan, which Chrysler was responsible for, and the rest is history. Chrysler had a good run. Then again, unfortunately, if we don't pay attention to history, we are often going to be making the same mistakes. Well, Chrysler went through another downturn here in the new millennium. And now, after a second bailout, now we're no longer even owned by a U.S. firm, right? They've been bought out by a more global company, Fiat. And make a long story short, I'm sure now there's some new thought processes going into the Chrysler product and distribution. Okay, but the vast majority of CFOs, CEOs, etc., are usually internal selections. There's some good arguments. Your textbook talked about where, for the most part, after about a 3-year time frame, you'll find that the internal selections oftentimes outperform the external selections. So I guess you really do need to take a look at that process. And just to change from the outside to bring in fresh ideas can be really positive and stimulating to a company, but it can have also a negative impact. And there's also lots of um, examples out there that we can take a look at. Okay, moving on. If you're going to select internally, and again, we said the majority of companies do, and if you do a good job, in the long run, that can lead to a higher level of success. You have to ensure that the company is setting up the parameters to do so, to set up that successor to take a role of an executive, whether it be the CEO, which is often the most difficult slot because that's your top executive within an organization, or any of your executive selections. Great care should be taken. In my small business classes, we talk about succession, and it has a relevance here with the big business because, as the textbook is pointing out, it's important there. Same with small business. I see a lot with small businesses where a micro small business started up by a sole proprietor. The sole proprietor retires, and unfortunately, because they haven't set up a selected a successor, the business, when they retire, the business oftentimes retires with them, which is could be sad, especially if you have employees who were counting on the business. But speaking of employees, I think they talk about leverage buyouts in this chapter. I mean, that is one thing you could do to help with the selling of the company, of course, is to set up that LBO where the management team that's in place could actually purchase the business and keep it going and have a new ownership that goes along with that. All right. What do I have here? We talked about inside and outside selection, managing your portfolio, and of course your resource portfolio, which I just touched on a minute ago, your four major resources. Um, your most difficult resource to manage, in my opinion, is the human resource, because as we know, all humans were pretty dang unique, and being uh, taking advantage of holding on to quality individuals, quality groups of individuals in your organization, setting up an organization that keeps turnover to a minimum. Uh, People sometimes will, not sometimes, oftentimes will stay with an organization because the culture is so pleasant. I mean, they might be able to make $1 more working for someone else, but when they weigh the differences, the culture could make a big difference. Intangible resources that, according to your textbook, include the capital, the human capital, which includes, of course, skills and knowledge. All of these working for your organization. So quite tough to replace easily. They also went into social capital, which refers to relationships among people working within the organization and with individuals and organizations outside the firm. Again, I'm looking down, I'm reading my notes. I don't mean to be rude. And then your chapter continues on for chapter 2, where it talks about the entrepreneurial culture. I have kind of a weakness, or I shouldn't say weakness. I actually have a bias, would be a better way of putting it. I heavily favor the entrepreneurial culture in an organization. Now, you have your four major cultures, organizational cultures. You have your marketing, which is also a very strong culture. You have your clan culture, and you have your bureaucratic culture, and of course now you have your entrepreneurial culture, which we're getting ready to talk about. And many organizations, when as they grow larger and larger and larger, we get to like the GM we're talking about, or the Chrysler. Unfortunately, they start to become more bureaucratic because the larger they get, the more policy, the more regulations are in place. There's no um, uh, entrepreneurial mindsets are sometimes not very welcomed. And an entrepreneur versus an entrepreneur, really quick to go over that. Where an entrepreneur owns their own business. They're risking their resources. It may be their investors' resources, which are oftentimes for many small businesses are family and friends. And so when you're looking at the big business, an entrepreneur is someone who has entrepreneurial qualities, but still playing with house money. That is the corporation's dollar. So there is a big difference where we're looking at in the entrepreneurial culture. You'll have entrepreneurs, but at the same time, the risk taking is with the company's money. In a bureaucratic organization, that's sometimes frowned upon as far as giving them a lot of leeway, a lot of options to have innovation and creativity, which can bog down a for-profit organization, can be quite detrimental to their long-term health. Or in the entrepreneurial organization, just the opposite. They're still instilling that with reason, with some controls necessary, right? You can still have an entrepreneurial culture with controls where people understand that the risk taking, and particularly the financial side, is that of the companies. But at the same time, you get companies like Google, which is very, very famous for their very entrepreneurial mindset, very much an entrepreneurial culture that they've set up with their organization. Again, I'm a very pro, bias might be the word, I'm very pro entrepreneurial culture set up in their organization. As your textbook put down, it allows, encourages, not only allows, but encourages employees to identify and exploit new opportunities. Um, it's a vital task. Entrepreneurial culture is a vital task, it says, according to your textbook, for strategic leaders to establish as far as the culture goes. All right. And then your textbook also in chapter 2 spent some time going over integrity and ethical behavior. Uh, you as leaders, you're setting up that by example, of course, you're setting that up, and you're going to need strong written policies and procedures that at least outline it, what the expectations are, whether it be through your HR. Well, I would include in your HR when the people are coming into your organization, so they understand the ethics are something that you hold near and dear to your heart in your organization, and you expect integrity. All of your leaders, especially at the executive level, are going to be looked up to and observed quite closely. To kind of wrap up that, when I spent a lot of time talking about executive level within an organization, of course, you're going to have your executive management, you're going to have your middle management, and you're going to have your first line supervisors. This is an extraordinary important team that you need to ensure that the flow of information is taking place in a way that's very methodical, but yet open to allowing creativity and innovation to still prosper. I find in many big organizations sometimes the executives are not fostering those bonds and those strong relationships with the middle and first line supervisors, and they start to believe they know what's best for an organization. Give you an example. I know somebody who worked in a federal department, and he was working with an organization within, the federal government's huge. He was working within a particular area of the federal government, and he was a first line supervisor, and he saw what was obvious to him. There was policies coming down from Washington D.C. that just really weren't working well. And what he did, when he gets down to the first line's like, the personnel are like, wow, if we do this is really going to irritate our customers, both internally and externally. So, make a long story short, what happened was he got the team to buy into the strategic planning that came down from Washington D.C., but he put a spin on it where, the regulations, the policies were followed, but he put a spin on it where they went above and beyond and offered more customer service by explaining to people what was taking place and why it was taking place, even though that wasn't written anywhere within um, these policies and procedures and standing operating procedures that were sent down. So he built it into the standing operating procedures within his team. He had his team leaders make sure for the different shifts that this was passed amongst them. And make a long story, which is still getting longer. I'm trying to keep it short. He got recognized for building upon the program. So let's give DC some credit. He was actually recognized first locally, and then he went and presented his ideas and concepts and how he improved on the DC process regionally. And of course, this was fed all the way back to Washington, D.C., and how they could do things even better, and to take his ideas and to expand on them and include them in the overall planning, strategic planning for the organization. Of course, this time the organizations happen to be that U.S. government, which is a pretty big organization. Anyways, we'll be spending more time as we move forward on this particular topic, and I look forward to going over Chapter 3 with you here really soon. Bye.